I'm photographer David duChemin, and this is Vision is Better, a sometimes weekly podcast about the craft and art of photography. Welcome here. Hey, thanks for joining me. I had a couple questions after the episode about histograms, and I thought I'd package two of them together. So the first question I had was, especially after talking about the whole exposed to the right idea, I think a lot of people, it's a little counterintuitive because it's not the way we used to expose with film. It's not the make it look right. The best film negative was the one that looked the way you want it to look. The best digital negative, if you intend to do any work at it all in Lightroom, if you intend to tinker it all in post-production, you want some flexibility to your file, and the most flexible file is the one with the most amount of data, which means you expose to the right of the histogram as much as you can without blowing out those highlights or without blowing out important highlights. That's one way of exposing. It is not the only way of exposing. And so the question I had was, can't I just expose this thing the way I want it to look? And the answer, of course you can. Absolutely you can. If you prefer to photograph with film, photograph with film. If you prefer to shoot digitally in JPG and you want to just make it look the way you want it to look, then do that too. There's a compromise. You could shoot in RAW as though you were shooting film. You would still have some latitude to play with. The sensors are getting better all the time. Just, remember, the LCD is not the full story. So very often, if I, for example, wanted to photograph something and I wanted to underexpose it, make those colors look really saturated, by the time I bring it to my monitor at home, it's not going to look as bright often as the LCD. So I've already told you that it's a good idea to dial your monitor down. If you're getting darker prints than you expected, then you need to bring your monitor's brightness down. You need to calibrate your monitor. But it's a good idea to do the same thing if you're trusting your LCD for the vibrancy and the saturation and to see details, how much you have and how much you don't have in the shadows, and you're not shooting with your histogram. Then you just have to be aware that you may lose some file flexibility, and it's a good idea to have your LCD sort of dialed down maybe to about 50%. If you are going to photograph that way, try to shoot with the lowest ISO that you can so that you've got some flexibility in your file. There's nothing saying that you can't shoot and just, quote, make it the way you want it to look. I think probably because of the way that digital has encouraged us to be a little loosey-goosey with our exposures and kind of play it by ear a little too much. Some of us are not quite as able to do that. I often shoot like that. I will shoot RAW and JPG, and I will often photograph, especially when I'm kind of, it's not that important to me, and I've really kind of nailed it on the first try, and I know that in Lightroom I'm not going to fiddle too much. Often I regret that decision, but there's no reason why you can't. Just be aware that they're two sort of different models of exposure. One is assuming that the best digital negative is the most amount of data because you're going to use Lightroom and Photoshop and you want some flexibility. You want to be able to twist that file a little bit without blowing the pixels apart. The other just is the make it look the way you want to, whether you shoot in JPG or RAW. I suggest RAW because you'll have more file flexibility. But either way you do it, just know what you're trying to accomplish and know what tools you're going to need. If you want to use Lightroom, you may need some more flexibility. The other question that I got was why it wasn't so much a question, it was more, I see you like to shoot in manual, I don't see the point. And so I guess the point for me in shooting in manual mode, and by this I mean exposure, not focus, is when you hold the camera to your eye and you're in aperture priority mode, and I use aperture priority, I use time, shutter priority, sometimes I'll just use program mode and just sort of throw it on P and see what happens. But when you're in aperture priority or shutter priority and you hold the camera up, the camera samples the light in the scene from a particular spot. and it makes some decisions based on its own logarithms and the sort of the math stuff behind the scenes. And if you are constantly moving that camera around, you can't quite get it, and you hold it up and then you shoot it and you look down and it's not quite right, and you move it around. The more you move that camera around, the more the camera is sort of, the camera's making its own guesses, and then you're kind of fiddling and moving, and there's too many variables. You're kind of mucking around with too many things. So it's easier, at least it is for me, to put it on manual, hold it up, make the shot, look down at it, and go, oh, I see I need a couple more stops of exposure. Boom, boom, a couple more stops of exposure, and click. If you're in aperture mode and you look down and you say, oh, I need a couple more stops of exposure, you dial up a couple more stops of exposure with your EV compensation. You bring the camera up to your face. Maybe you're pointing it at something a little different. You've composed it a little different. Maybe the sun has kind of, you know, come out and changed, and all of a sudden your metering second guesses your decision about two stops, and then you've got this moving target. And so my suggestion is at least be comfortable photographing in manual mode. At least have a sense of where the dials are. That's why I love my XT1. I love to be, or my Leica, I love to be able to just move things around without the digital workflow isn't working for me. It's not working for me the same way that it used to. At least know where things are, be comfortable with it, and be able to expose manually when you need to. If the light is changing very quickly, some people prefer to be in AV mode because it kind of catches up as long as it's not too tricky a scenario. If the light is changing fairly quickly, but it's a fairly simple scene, I actually prefer to be in manual mode because I know, oh, you know, the sun's just come out, I've got a couple more stops, click, click, and I'm not, it's one of us second guessing the scene and making decisions. It's not me and the camera both working at odds against each other. So it's horses for courses. You pick the mode that you want to use, but there are strong advantages to manual mode. And if you're finding that you're struggling with getting the right exposure, I strongly suggest, at least for a time, that you go to manual mode so that it's only one of you making the decision. It's not you and your camera kind of fighting together. So shoot in JPEG, shoot in RAW, do whatever you want, but make sure you understand why you're doing it. In terms of your digital negative, I strongly suggest that you at least give yourself the fighting chance that you need by giving yourself the most file flexibility. That's the biggest, most robust file, which means exposing more to the right. One of the other questions I had was, how come it used to be the other way around? And I'm not sure that it was. I'm not sure that it ever was that we were encouraging people to expose more to the left, except that before we started shooting in RAW, recovering blown highlights was really difficult, and it's still really difficult if you're shooting in JPEG. So if you're shooting in JPEG, watch those highlights. Turn on the blinkies, make sure you know exactly what detail you're losing, because it's very hard to recover even a full stop of detail from most JPEG files. In a RAW file, you can recover at least a couple stops of blown highlights. So for the trade-off in terms of having a larger file, it's definitely well worth it to at least consider photographing in RAW format, and most cameras can pull that off, even the smaller point and shoot compacts. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Please, in the meantime, would you subscribe and leave some comments? I don't need the comments that say, wow, this is really great, though I appreciate them. What I'm really looking forward to is I'm looking for an opportunity to interact with you in a meaningful way and answer your questions. So if there are things that you've been wondering, if someone said this and you wonder if it's not that, if I've said something that's confused you, God knows I'm not totally consistent all the time, leave a question and let's see if we can clear that up. All right, we'll see you next time. Take care.